is Fragmented, an Android developer podcast where we talk about building good software and becoming better Android developers. I'm Don Felker.
And I'm Kaushik Gopal.
Welcome to episode number 10.
All right. So this is a very special episode, Don. Do you know why?
Probably because we made it to 10 episodes so far, and because we have a great guest on as well.
All right. So we have our very good friend and long-term supporter for this very special 10th episode. Welcome to the show, Michael.
Hey, guys. Thanks for having me.
So what are we going to talk about today, Kaushik?
So basically, in the last few episodes that we've talked about, there were in fact two topics. One was Android Studio and the other was in testing. And I believe in both we sort of alluded or maybe added links to Michael Bailey's talks, because Michael Bailey is just amazing at almost every topic under the sun. So what we thought this time we'll do with this episode is sort of go in depth to another topic that he's amazing at, and that's basically on core Java. So for people who are interested in sort of boning up their core Java skills, today would be a good episode to listen to.
Definitely. I think today's going to be a great show. I know I've spoken to Michael many times. Michael's actually local to me here in Phoenix, and he has spoken at the Phoenix Android group out here and has a ton of knowledge in this space. So I guess let's hop right into it. Before we get really into the Java content, Michael, can you kind of tell us basically a little bit about yourself, maybe where you work and what you do and so forth?
Yep, definitely. I am an Android engineer at American Express. I work on our main U.S. consumer app. So it's the one that you can get if you have a consumer card. Check your bill and use your points to redeem transactions and many other cool things in there. So that's kind of my day-to-day job. I actually started that app as the original developer back in 2010. So wow. I don't know. So I've been working on that app for about 5 years now. So it's gone through a lot of change, and Android's changed a lot. And trying to keep that app up with all the different build systems and things like that, there's been interesting to see the code base evolve over those years.
I know I've told this to you already before, Michael, but American Express has one of the most amazing Android apps. The very first time I actually used the app, I was kind of surprised. I didn't even expect that level of quality from a credit card company, because I didn't think it would be that important for them to have a good app. And also because I guess historically most of the credit card apps that I have are terrible. So American Express is an amazing app, so good job there.
Thanks for that. Yeah, it's definitely a very important to Amex, and one of the great things is we have a great design team too, very meticulous about the detail that they go through, and they keep us developers on point with making sure we hit all the details correct. So having a great design team, I think, makes Android development that much more enjoyable.
Working at Amex, the challenges that you face specifically for developing in Android, do you have any special sort of constraints because you work at Amex? Like maybe with credit cards, there's this thing that's a little special to the credit card field that isn't for most normal Android developers. Is there anything along those lines?
Yeah, I mean, so Amex has a lot of different apps. On my particular app that I work on, we don't have the camera in our app. So I know you guys have touched on that can always be a challenge. We do have other apps that have the camera, which is not really specific to Amex, but I know anytime I talk to somebody who has to put the camera in their app, they lament about all the different hardware options that they have to support. I'll say one thing that you find, and it's of a product requirement that you'll find in credit card apps, is that you have to keep the login session short, which you don't find in a lot of other Android apps. And actually that sort of inactivity timeout when the user's not using your app and trying to figure out what to do is something that takes quite a bit of work. It sounds like a simple thing, but getting that right in all sorts of scenarios, if the app's backgrounded, what happens if the process dies, what happens if did they back out of your app, did they go to the home screen, did a phone call come in, and trying to make sure that you do something that's not too surprising to the user in all those scenarios is pretty can be pretty challenging. One of the things I came across we use RxJava. So specifically when you're using timeouts in RxJava, when the CPU goes to sleep, all of the timeout APIs, object.wait, thread.sleep, in Android are all based on CPU time. That time doesn't seem to pass. So when the CPU comes back awake, it doesn't think any time's passed and the timeouts don't happen, which probably is a concern for other things if you're using the timeout related stuff in RxJava. But there is an API in Android called systemclock.elapsedRealtimeNanos, which gives you wall time, but or real time, and it's monotonically increasing, so you don't have to worry about the user setting their clock back and things like that. It always progresses forward. The challenge is that there's no API to simply wait and wake up based on that. So all of the ones that let you wait are based on the CPU being awake and that timeline, whereas you can pull the time. You can say, what is the elapsed real time? But there's no thing that says wait until this elapsed real time comes about. So you have to get get creative there to make that work. You can use the alarm manager API to set a pending intent to happen at a specific time, but that will wake up the CPU, which is kind of probably why there's nothing that waits on elapsed real time, because your process is not awake maybe, and so waking it up, it has to be a system level thing to wake up your process. So if you really need to do that, you can use the alarm thing to send a pending intent and wake up your app. Of course, then you're waking up the CPU, so it better be something that's important to the user, that you're using up extra battery by waking up the CPU for just your app's needs. So it's definitely it's seemingly simple product requirement, but it can definitely have a lot of edge cases.
It's one of those features where you look at it initially and say, yeah, that shouldn't be too bad. Then a week and a half, 2 weeks later, you're still working on it, kind of thing.
Exactly.
You're like, 5 minutes, one timer task, and job done.
Yeah.
So we have something new, interesting came out at Google I/O this year, and that's Android Pay. And seeing that you work in basically the finance area, similar to that I do at this time, what do you think about Android Pay? What excites you about it? Is there anything that's interesting? Do you think it's going to be a game changer, or is it something that's just kind of an additional play that Google's making to match what Apple's doing? What's your thoughts on Android Pay in general?
Yeah, so I was at Google I/O, and to me, I personally was excited to see the Amex card art in the keynote. It's always nice to see your brand in the keynote.
Very cool.
But overall, I think I've been using Google Wallet, so I'm excited that Android Pay doesn't make you launch the app when you want to tap to pay. You can just tap to pay and then authenticate, whereas before, using Google Wallet, you had to open the app and enter in a PIN and things like that. So it was, you had to get ready to be able to tap there.
Does it work similar to Apple Pay now, in that you don't have to open up the app?
I actually haven't used any Android Pay. I've just seen what they had in the keynote. So, yeah, but that I think is what they said, is that you will be able to tap without opening up the app. It's an OS level thing.
Okay.
I think, which will be much appreciated. And one of the nice things about Apple Pay going first is when you used to use Google Wallet, or when I used to use Google Wallet, the cashier would often give you a strange look and be like, what are you doing? Don't do that. Just swipe your card. Right? And now people don't give you as weird a look because they're used to Apple Pay. So the one nice thing about Apple doing that is now at least cashiers don't give you that strange look and think you're trying to do something really odd. So,
are you trying to hack my system, son?
Yes. So tapping your phone is no longer just a weird tech thing that only tech people do.
And that's all based on NFC for the listeners that aren't aware at this time.
Yep, definitely. It's Apple Pay is based on NFC payments. Android Pay is based on NFC payments. Even the existing Google Wallet is based on NFC payments.
So I've heard basically that right now, even at locations that accept Apple Pay, you can basically just use Google Wallet's NFC thingy and do payments. Is that true? Have you ever tried that?
Yep. Yeah. So it's more accepting. So if you accept American Express NFC payments, then Apple Pay or Android Pay or tapping your piece of plastic shouldn't matter. So all of those will work. It all goes over the same technology if they accept American Express NFC payments.
All right. So we're going to try to switch gears a little and touch on some of the other topics that I know both Don and I are super thrilled about and want to ask you about. And the very first one is obviously Android Studio. Now, you are sort of like this super ninja. Amazing ninja. I was trying to find an adjective for ninjas, and I'm like, what do you add on to a ninja? You don't add any adjectives to a ninja, right?
I saw this tweet recently, and I wish I could say who tweeted it to give them credit, but they said that they should apply for a job where they say, "Oh, we need a software ninja," and then not show up the first day, and they're like, "Well, why didn't you show up?" And they're like, "Exactly."
I did see that tweet. That would be an amazing troll on the company. All right, so Michael, how long have you been using Android Studio? Or I should sort of ask, how long have you been using Intellij?
So I think I started using Intellij at version 2.5.
Whoa! What?
And I think the 15 EAP just came out. So I guess it's been about 13 versions or so that I've been using Intellij. It was great back then, but it definitely gets better every version. And the amount of with that many versions, a lot of products can degrade or they can kind of lose their focus over time. But I think it's just gotten better and better.
So then that means, I guess, you weren't doing Android development all the way since version 2, correct? What was your background in just traditional Java development?
Yeah, so before Android came along, and actually when I started American Express, my primary focus was Java development. At some point, I did some Swing development and some, I have some server-side experience and things like that. Cool. But then I got into, when Android came along, it was an opportunity to do some UI programming, which I enjoy, and use Java. So it was just a great fit, and so I really dove into that when Android came out.
Nice. So you're obviously a veteran at this point. Are there any sort of favorite plugins as such in Android Studio or certain extensions that you feel that we should be using?
I think the one that comes up often is the key promoter plugin. That if you are not familiar with the keystrokes, that is really one of the main power points that gives you a lot of power in Intellij, is to know the keystrokes. So if that helps you learn them, then use that. Otherwise, just print out the keystroke guide and keep it next to your keyboard and force yourself to use it. I don't use that one anymore. It is on purpose kind of annoying. I mean, that's the whole purpose of it, is it annoys you into using it. And maybe I should go back to using it. I'm sure there's plenty of keystrokes that I still don't know. But yeah, that's a great one, and I think that's really, in any environment, I think you can get a lot of productivity gains by really understanding all the features. Like all the different refactorings, all the different editor features and things like that, and then also the keyboard shortcuts, so you're not constantly moving your hand back and forth between the keyboard and the mouse. So for people that aren't familiar with what Key Promoter is, it's something I also promote heavily in all my talks. Key Promoter, like Michael's saying, is very annoying. It's, like you said, purposely annoying. And at a high level, let's say that you consistently click on Attach to Process inside of Android Studio, and you do it once, twice, and maybe around the third time. What happens is this plugin knows exactly what you're doing, saying, hey, you keep clicking this button.
by the way, there's a keyboard shortcut for this. Use this keyboard shortcut. Or if there's not a keyboard shortcut associated with it, it'll say, hey, would you like to create a keyboard shortcut to do this? And it's insanely annoying to the point where you just don't want to see the message anymore, so you start using the keyboard shortcut. So I highly recommend it as well.
Yeah, and there's another one. It's not a plugin. It's actually built in, and it's one of the things I talk about in my talks. It's called the Productivity Guide. It's under the Help menu, and that Productivity Guide will tell you which features you use most often and which ones you've never used. So it's a good thing to browse through and be like, what is this feature? I've never heard of it, and then go look up the documentation and kind of maybe take a couple a week and practice using that to see if it can boost your productivity. So. And then, it's also just interesting to see stats because people like stats on what you use. So usually like, oh man, I've done code completion, 40,000 times, which, can show you the power of knowing those things. So
one thing that I would love to bring up here with the keyboard shortcuts is one I actually learned from you, Michael, at your talk. I don't know, I think close to 6 to 9 months ago here in Phoenix. And it's one that you showed me, which is inside of Android Studio, you can use Alt plus Up, and this is using the key bindings for 10.5 plus, and that will select the current, the current word, and then you can select it again to go to the next section, and so forth. I use that so much now that when I hop into other text editors like Sublime Text or even inside of Google Docs, I'll press Alt Up and it doesn't work, and then I get annoyed because I just want it to work. So that's been a huge productivity boost.
Yeah, I love that shortcut. It's basically syntactic select. So it the great thing is it works across file types. So whether you're in Java or XML or JSON or JavaScript, Intellij is smart enough to know the syntax of that file, and when you press Alt Up, it increasingly increases the scope of what it's selecting based on what it knows about the syntax of the file. So it's very good about selecting kind of that just the exact right chunk that you want to move or refactor.
Right, and it also goes the opposite direction for listeners. So you can hit Alt down and it will decrease the scope as well. So that's super helpful.
The last little bit here on the whole Android Studio Intellij thing. For those that aren't familiar, Jetbrains is the company that helps create Intellij and Android Studio and so forth. They actually have a bunch of other products. So if you do PHP development or Node or Ruby or Python, they have IDEs for each one of those, and I actually use almost all those IDEs. All of these keyboard shortcuts and usually all of the plugins work inside of all of those as well. So just a quick tip. So if you hear something you like and you're like, hey, I'd like to apply that to my Node development, you can find the plugins for that, and the keyboard shortcuts like syntactic select also work inside of those as well.
Yeah, I would say I'm a bit of a JetBrains fanboy, but part of my requirement for any technology that I'm probably willing to work on is that can I do the development not on Windows, and can I do the development using JetBrains product? Those are kind of two requirements for me even looking at something that I might want to develop with.
Those are good heuristics, and I think that transitions perfectly into kind of what we should talk about next, and that's testing. And I know that you're very passionate about testing. You've given a talk around talks here in Phoenix and numerous other places, New York, Silicon Valley, and so forth, if I remember correctly, about testing. And I know that recently Google had acquired a company called Appurify. Are you familiar with that at all?
Yeah, so they announced the Appurify acquisition, or at least I became aware of it at Google I/O in 2014. So they said, hey, we've acquired Appurify, and we're going to, keep it around and make it awesome. And I think in 2014 they said that they were going to keep the iOS support for it. I don't know if that's still the case. But then you didn't hear anything for about a year. But then at 2015, and it was one of the things I was really hoping that they would give an update on, and they did. They've rebranded it and as Cloud Test Lab, and kind of relaunched that, relaunched some of the stuff that they had acquired. And again, I still haven't gotten access to it, so I'm super excited to get access to it.
I think it's still in beta or something. I'm not even sure it's released to the public just yet. You can go and sign up and give your email address, and in a standard Google form they say, oh, we'll let you know as soon as we're ready to release it to the public.
Exactly. Yes, and so I'm very excited to get early access to that. But yeah, so I think Appurify was based purely on hardware devices. So they had a cloud of physical devices plugged in that you could run tests on. But from what I gathered at I/O, they now have, in addition to the capability to run on real hardware devices, they also have what they call virtual devices, which they were careful to distinguish between a virtual device and the Android emulator.
Right.
So apparently it's, and I don't think there's a ton of details on it yet, but it sounds like what they've done is they've taken the Android OS and compiled it to as if they're Google Cloud instances, their x86 Google Cloud instances that are independent of Android, were a device. So they basically said, we have a new device, which is a cloud instance in Google, and let's compile the Android operating system for that and just run it directly there. So in theory, that can, I mean, it sounds like that would probably give you a good performance boost. So I'm very interested to see how that works out, because the ability to have a very predictable testing environment where you can spin these up very quickly and shut them down, I think would be very valuable. We do in-house, we have a whole farm of Jenkins servers with real devices attached via USB, and it's a lot of management. I think one of my coworkers calls it device whispering. Where you have to go and unplug things and replug things and reboot devices. And, we've automated some of that, but, it's hard to, there's always some issue you run into, and somebody's always, on HipChat saying, hey, can you just pull that device off the machine so that somebody can take a look at what the problem is. And really, a lot of these devices were meant for consumers and not meant to be running apps 24/7 on your CI build. So sometimes the devices just don't hold up well. So is the
focus on Cloud Test Lab more on like a CI kind of service then? Because if they're using these virtual devices, right? I thought one of the advantages with having these kind of Cloud Test Labs is you can sort of run your app across a multitude of like different devices that you otherwise wouldn't purchase, you wouldn't purchase every single one of them. So I thought that was also part of the value, but it seems that isn't the focus, or are we just not sure yet?
Yeah, I'm not sure. It sounded like that they would have, it didn't sound like they were going to have like hundreds and hundreds of different types of devices. It sounded like they would have, I don't know, more in the tens of numbers of devices in terms of physical devices, and then this virtual device cloud. And then they also announced an integration with the Play Store where they'll be kind of running their own, it's kind of like a smart monkey type thing. So they actually analyze your view hierarchy and look for places that are clickable and things like that. So as opposed to the monkey, which just sends random input events and who knows if it's clicking on anything real, I think what they have, I forget if they called it Smart Monkey or something like that. They're, as part of Cloud Test Lab, they have something that's a little bit smarter about clicking through your app in a random fashion and trying to hit all the screens. And I think they actually provide some sort of output where it actually shows like, hey, here are the screens we were able to get to in your app when we were just trying to click around randomly with this thing. And I think that part will be free as part of the Play Store, where you can submit, if you submit through that, maybe the alpha channel or something, then they'll run your APK through this kind of smart monkey type thing that they have. So definitely interested in learning more, and hopefully more details. I'm sure there'll be a lot more details when they announce it.
Right. You know what I think they should call they shouldn't call it like, the smart monkey. They should either call it Monkey 2.0, or my other brilliant name is maybe Chimp, like chimpanzee or something.
You should work in a marketing department, Kaushik.
I know, right? I have these amazing ideas. What am I doing here? All right. So just to wind up with testing, I know there were a couple of other great I/O sessions on testing, and it was nice to see the focus on testing this time at I/O. Did you pick up anything else from the I/O sessions, Michael, or do you think most of it is already available?
No, so there was some good sessions that I don't even know that they were recorded, and maybe they'll come out as dev bites. But the espresso sessions, they actually announced a new version of espresso in those sessions. So they had espresso 2.2. I can't remember if it was an add-on or if it's the core espresso, but they announced as part of 2.2, they announced web view support.
Oh wow!
Yeah.
So you're able to test things within your web views. So that was
a godsend.
That was exciting. Yeah. So that we kind of have our own very lightweight, very crude home-built thing for doing some UI tests with web views, but I'm looking forward to being able to use their version of web view testing so that we don't have to maintain our own internal one. So
I guess now we should drop into the main topic. Clearly, we've been very brief, only 20 minutes in. Okay, so let's talk about core Java. Now, I know this is something that's always interested many of our listeners. How does one really get better at pure Java development? And also, is it important to be a really good Java developer if you're going to be working on Android all day?
Yeah, I would say it's super important, and I would say it's also one of the things that in my experience interviewing people that I will find people who know Android, but they are more often weak on their core Java skills. So I would say that's, and usually I find that, core Java skills are the more important thing, and Android APIs are something that easier to learn over time. But if you don't have that foundation of pure Java knowledge and how things work, then Android is going to be even that much more difficult. I mean, there's a lot of difficult things that you have to understand and just annoyances you have to get through in Android. But if you're also battling a lack of knowledge of core Java, it's going to be pretty frustrating.
I think that's dead on the spot, and a lot of people will come from different languages too. So they'll bring some of their knowledge over here that doesn't maybe apply to Java or to Android in general. And so having those core concepts down are key. One of the big ones I see right out of the gate, initially that I've noticed in interviewing folks and dealing with other developers is just the basic concept of composition versus inheritance. And I think maybe we should talk about that a little bit. Maybe kind of what does it mean? Because we kind of know that inheritance, you're going to inherit something, a class extends something else, but we also have things like interface inheritance and so forth. And, so we have that whole topic of composition versus inheritance. Which one is better than the other one? Do you have any thoughts on inheritance and composition and so forth, Michael?
Yeah, I think it was in the Gang of Four book, if I remember correctly, that they say prefer composition over inheritance is one of their pieces of advice.
Was it the Gang of Four or was it Effective Java by Joshua Block?
I think it was Gang of Four.
Interesting. Okay. I know Effective Java because, many of these tips are some things like that I've mentioned, and both are amazing books. Listeners should absolutely. We'll add links, obviously, to both books in the show notes. Effective Java by Joshua Block, he talks about these sort of bullet points, like they call them items or something. And The Gang of Four, obviously, is a book on patterns. So just to give listeners an idea about what those books are.
Yeah, and I find Effective Java very readable, whereas Gang of Four seems a little more dry to me. I actually haven't gotten through the whole thing, but Effective Java, it's like, maybe it's just the nerd in me, but it's one of those books you just want to read the whole way through because it's very approachable, very practical, and you can get through it. And there's a lot of great stuff in the second edition there. So yeah, that's one of maybe my favorite tech book is that Effective Java. Definitely a great recommendation.
Right. So they say favor composition over inheritance. So could you give us a little better idea on what that is?
Yeah. So in Java, inheritance of implementation is single inheritance. So you can only inherit. Well, it kind of changed with Java 8 because now you have default methods.
Right.
So you can inherit some implementation from interfaces, and you can inherit multiple interfaces. But most people are not using Java 8 for Android development. So
sigh.
Yeah, which is a bummer. Yeah. So without default methods, you get single inheritance of implementation, and it becomes part of your public API. So when you inherit something, the inheritance hierarchy is part of your public API. So especially if you're exposing something as a library, that's something that people may depend on, and if you change it, it's definitely a breaking change if you change the inheritance hierarchy. The other thing is, so because you can only have this single inheritance hierarchy, it's really hard to compose different things. So if you try to compose different functionality, you can end up with trying to, with a combinatorial explosion of all possible combinations of the things you want to compose together. So I remember, like in RoboJuice, I think they have like, Robo list fragment and Robo max fragment, because you want to compose both the RoboJuice functionality that you're inheriting plus the inheritance of list fragment or whatever, right? So then you've got to combine all these things, and now if you want another type of list fragment that also inherits the RoboJuice things, you have to have a new combination of these things. And now also, if you have your own internal things that you need to have across multiple fragments or activities or whatever, you now have to have those in combination with all of the other things. So in terms of being able to compose different things, the single inheritance definitely will limit you. So if you use composition, meaning it can be more of an internal detail of your class, depending on how you compose those things. So if you take them in the constructor, then depending on how you do dependency injection, or if you have static factory methods, it may be exposed in terms of what you depend on, because people may have to pass in those dependencies into your class to instantiate your class. But also you can have it as an internal detail where it's like, I use one of these things because I need list functionality, but it's not part of my inheritance hierarchy, so that you can mix and match more easily, where you just have references to these various pieces of behavior that you need inside of your class, and then you can compose those inside of your class in an easier way, that you don't kind of get this crazy inheritance hierarchy with all sorts of combinations of various functionality.
Absolutely. And one sort of a situation where I've also found it tricky is, for example, when we talk about inheritance, essentially what we're talking about is if one class extends, if a subclass sort of extends a superclass. So if you have functionality that changes over time in the superclass, then that basically means your subclass like depends directly on that because it extends the superclass. So that sort of adds this like fragility. But if you've used a composition kind of pattern where you actually have like an instance and you compose the characteristics of the superclass inside, then that gives you that little flexibility to be able to like sort of not get affected by the functionality of a superclass.
And I think Effective Java has some great advice on this this type of thing as well. And I think what they say essentially is, if you have a class and you design it for inheritance, then make sure you document that it is designed for inheritance, how you should inherit from it, what things you need to know. And if it's not designed for inheritance, then you should consider making the class final so that people don't accidentally inherit from it. Because if you change something in the superclass and it's not explicitly documented, and the person who subclassed your class makes various assumptions on parts of your superclass, then now when you change your superclass, you break all the people who extended from it. So it's a very tenuous relationship between the superclass and the subclass.
I have a photographic memory, so I remember it's on page 61, item 15, design and document for inheritance or else prohibited. What? You don't believe me? I was kidding. I pulled up the book and I just read it.
You have a bookmark in it, I know.
Yeah, and the great thing about those things like item 15 or whatever, the item is, they're great for code reviews because, you could say, well, in item 17, it says this. So it can kind of, if there's a discussion, usually you can settle on, well, let's just do it that way because we know it meets our needs and it's fairly well accepted advice.
I don't want to go into a code review with you, Michael, man. Wow.
Do you shame them? You're like, read this chapter and not even give any other comments, and then when they read it, they're like, oh man, Michael just tore me apart.
No, we try to be we try to be very kind in our code reviews and more of a mentoring opportunity. And honestly, I get a lot of value out of people reviewing my code. So at our company, the most junior guy gets to review the most senior guy's code. So it's and vice versa. So it's very it's a good thing, and you can learn a lot from other people's experience that way.
Every one or few days, like I keep looking at the code. I'm like, which idiot wrote this code? This code is terrible. You shouldn't be doing things like this. I do a blame, and I'm like, Kaushik. I'm like, oh.
Yeah. And that goes back to another really nice Intellij feature, is that if you context click or right click in the gutter of your editor, you can say show annotations, and it basically shows you the git blame or whatever subversion blame of who wrote what line, when, what change it was part of. So yeah, often I'll open it up and I'll see who wrote this, and then I wrote that.
So the competition versus inheritance is kind of compounded inside of Android, because we have a lot of things in Android that, like you said, you had brought up the topic of robo-juicing, robo-list activity, robo-map activity, robo-activity, etc. And the reason those things are there is because we need the same functionality across these various different activities. And just recently, the app-compat delegate was released. And I found this very interesting because when I first looked at the code, it allows you to have some type of delegate that you can use, inside of different activities or various other locations if you really wanted to. And when I looked at the code, it almost felt like they being Google, were looking directly at the code from MyFitnessPal when I worked with them, and the engineering lead, or the Android engineering lead, Eric Burke there, wrote almost the exact same thing, and we called it the MFP activity delegate. So this was so we could share all of the same type of code across various different activities. Do you guys do anything, or do you have any recommendation around that? So if I have a list activity, a traditional activity, and so forth, do you do anything so you can perform the same callbacks without duplicating code all over the place? Do you have anything like a delegate that you use?
So I don't know if it addresses that specific situation, but what we end up doing is we use Dagger a lot. So in our current implementation, we use Dagger, and then we usually at the top of our class we will have a list of injects and with activities, because you can't do a constructor injection. It's field injection or in your fragments. And those are kind of your reusable pieces of functionality that you can kind of mix and match. So I would say that, and we have, basically our superclass just knows how to make sure that things get injected. So that's kind of the code that we have at the top level, is that if you extend from this fragment, you can know that things are going to be injected at the right time. And so then you can just very easily saying, oh, well, for this functionality, I need these three things. So I can @inject, 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 and then mix and match, in there as you're composing your logic for that screen.
But one tricky aspect towards this whole, the reason I like app-compat delegate so much is because one of the problems with, for example, if you use different versions of like the support library, there was fragment activity, then there was action bar activity, then there's just the normal activity, and now you have app-compat activity. I like app-compat delegate because it allows you to sort of use your own base activity. And this is, again, a good pattern that most people should follow. You should have like a base activity for your own code and have like the logic that's sort of more specific to your application in that base activity. What happened with the app-compat sort of change that was brought in is that you also have to extend app-compat activity. What makes it difficult with these kind of activities versus any other superclass is that there's the life cycle is important, right? And it becomes very difficult to sort of like compose multiple activities and still adhere to the life cycle.
Yeah, no, I think I think that having the logic and as much as you can separate out things from the inheritance hierarchy, I think you're going to be in a much better place, because not all of your fragments activities, whatever you're using, are going to need all these various combinations of things. So if you try to have a super activity that does everything that every screen in your app needs, I mean, it's going to be very unwieldy. So if they try to have some super activity that has all of the support library stuff, right, in the inheritance hierarchy, plus all of your stuff, I mean, it's just going to, it's going to get very complicated very quickly.
So one good thing to do is basically make the machines work for us, right? So considering this aspect, there are certain tools that would help you basically write better Java code. And this is usually along the lines of like static code analyzers. So do any of you want to jump in and sort of like let our listeners know what exactly are static code analyzers?
Yeah, so one thing I'll say up front is that one reason I like Java is because it's statically typed. So you know at compile time what the type of things are, and you don't have to wonder is this an integer or a string or whatever at runtime. And, so that gives a lot of power to the static analysis tools and to the IDE in terms of being able to do refactorings and the IDE being able to tell you things. So static analysis tools are tools that look at your code before the code is actually running, meaning the code is it's not dynamic, it's static, it's just sitting there, and it's able to look at your type information, look at all the various things that are available at compile time, and point out common bug patterns, things that you may want to do differently. We use Checkstyle. Checkstyle is mainly focused on making sure that your code meets some, is formatted according to the rules that you give it. So it's configurable. You can give it Checkstyle rules. So we kind of have this thing where we have a code style set up for Intellij that we can all use that roughly as close as it can reflects our Checkstyle rules, so that you can tell Intellij or Android Studio, please format my code, and it will keep the code formatted according to Checkstyle. But then we also run Checkstyle just to make sure on our CI servers, and any Checkstyle violations that aren't explicitly ignored will fail the build. So because if you don't do that and you just let warnings crop up, then you kind of get this broken window syndrome where it's like, there was already 50 warnings, what's 51 warnings, right? So we try to keep it at zero. We keep it at zero Checkstyle warnings because we run that before you're able to merge your commit, your PR. Stash won't let you merge unless all your builds pass.
So that's a question I had. Is it not possible to sort of match the Checkstyles and like the Intellij code style? Do they have to exist independently, or is there a way that we can sort of point them to just one place?
I mean, I don't know. I think Square is open sourced their Intellij code style plugin, so ours is based off of that. It's not exactly the same. And then I think some of their open source projects may have Checkstyle files in there as well that kind of match that. So that's one good place to start. I don't know of any tools that kind of keeps the two in sync. So if you change one, you kind of have to make the corresponding change in the other. Since Intellij is open source, it seems like somebody could, rip out some of the part of the code style thing and make it a little bit more seamless rather than having to manually sync between the two different set of rules.
And one thing you can do with Intellij is basically you can right-click a folder and apply your code style to the sucker like completely at the global level. So if you want to just like run like a reformatting kind of process for like your code, you can just like go ahead and do that. People may not be very happy because you're essentially touching every single file, so your Git history is going to look crazy. But just, I mean, like if you want to like sort of have like this intervention kind of point where you're like all the code is going to follow this code style, then you can just go ahead and run through that.
Yeah, do it across the board. And then after that, once you kind of get it in good shape, there's an option in Intellij to just reformat the text that is changed in the VCS. So reformat VCS change text. So it will look like, here is the text that you have changed since, in this commit. So only reformat that code. So it really avoids the problem of having just a bunch of formatting related things in your Git commit.
Right. And also one built-in sort of static code analyzer that's extremely powerful and that everyone should absolutely use is the Android Lint in itself. So Android Studio comes with the Android Lint And essentially what it does is very similar to the things that we've been talking about. There's this nice blog post that I ran across, and it's by Vincent Bryson. I'm probably pronouncing that wrong. Sorry about that, Vincent. But there's this nice blog post where he talks about how you can integrate many tools, the Android Lint, Checkstyle. There are some other ones called Findbugs and PMD as well. All these are essentially static code analysis tools. So he talks about how you can integrate that with your Gradle build process. So you can have like a task that essentially runs through like all of these code styles before you even want to commit or something. So we'll add a link to that in the show notes. I thought it was very good. I actually added Findbugs alone. I haven't added Checkstyle because, again, like we mentioned, I don't want to go the code style, Checkstyle sort of like discrepancy makes me feel a little worried, but Findbugs I thought was amazing, and I could catch some things. And what's nice about these tools is it's not a super dumb sort of like, oh, well, do you have like a bracket or do you not have a bracket? It actually adds like suggestions to improve your Java code. So definitely everyone should check that out. 2 quick announcements with that regard. One is Facebook recently open sourced, Facebook has been like on this run where they're open sourcing a bunch of things. So that's a good step. They have this tool called Infer, and it's open sourced. So people, if you're interested, you can have a look at that. And also there's this article that our good friend Dan Liu pointed me towards, and it's by John Carmack. And for those of you who don't know, John Carmack is basically like this demigod, amazing programmer. If he says something, you should definitely just listen to what he says. He now works on at Oculus. I believe he's the CTO at Oculus. So there's this article where he talks about static code analysis. And this guy is like a crazy good developer, right? And if he says, well, you should be using this as much as possible, as often as you can, then you should probably listen to him and sort of like try to incorporate that. We'll add a link to the show notes. It's amazing. It's always so much fun listening from people like John Carmack.
Yeah, definitely agree that static analysis is very important. And we try to, as much as we can, make all warnings errors just so that we keep it clean. So for Android Lint, Findbugs, if you create something that it doesn't like, it's going to fail the build. So I highly recommend that you make that a policy on your CI server.
Now, speaking of failing builds and almost failing applications, let's move on to one of the next topics, and that's garbage collection in Android. I think this is a topic near and dear to many Android developers because the beautiful out-of-memory exception that gets thrown,
of which John is a big fan of. He has like this placard called OOM.
Yeah, I think you are the president of that company working at a camera-based startup. So you've probably seen it a lot more than I have. But I did spend in the early days of Android a lot of time dealing with out-of-memory exceptions, and then having to really hop into the garbage collector inside of Android and recycle bitmaps and all kinds of different stuff. Now, inside of the garbage collection in Android, one of the topics that's always been brought up is we should avoid creating too many objects. Do you know why that's said, Michael?
So any object that you create, especially if you're creating a lot, it's going to have to be garbage collected. And especially on Dalvik and older, they didn't have the moving collector, so that if you created a lot of these objects, it would go through and clean them out, but it would leave, I guess, a fragmented heap. It would leave a bunch of holes in there, so then you'd have smaller holes where it would have to try to figure, if you have a bigger object, it would have to try to figure out where to put it. It's gotten better with art because art will actually move your memory around to make space for bigger objects. But really the biggest problem that you'll see on Android, I think, is that garbage collections, especially on Dalvik, can take 5 milliseconds, 10 milliseconds, and if you're trying to have a smooth app, Google always talks about the 16 millisecond barrier, where at least on the main thread, you want to be able to draw every frame in 16 milliseconds. So if you're giving up 5 to 10 milliseconds for a garbage collection in there, it's going to skip that frame, and essentially it only draws once every 16 milliseconds. So if you skip one frame, it looks like you're going to notice it because really the next one's not going to be drawn until about 30 milliseconds. So If you have too much garbage collection in there, it's going to make your app janky.
So this is like an established computer science concept. It isn't something that's specific to Android. It's something that's like it works with the JVM, right? As I understand, there are different kinds of garbage collections, right? So the mark and sweep collection is a common pattern for doing this. You mentioned the differences in like moving collector between Dalvik and Art, but do they both use the mark and sweep sort of strategy for garbage collection?
I actually don't know the exact algorithms that they
Right.
move. I mean, that's a pretty, or that they use. That's a pretty common one, and I mean, it's at least on desktop JVMs, you can pick your garbage collector. You don't really get that choice on, and you can profile your app with different garbage collectors. On Android, you're stuck with, the one in Dalvik or the one in Art. So you can't pick the garbage collector to fit your app. You have to change your app to fit the garbage collector that you're given.
Right. There's a really nice I/O talk that was given a couple of years back on like the whole garbage collection sort of process. And they talk about how it's actually done. So they have like this graph where you basically traverse down the whole graph and then you notice any allocations. And if there are like certain objects that haven't been allocated, they just like dump them. So that's essentially like, that's like the 1 minute explanation of what the mark and sweep garbage collection is. We'll add a link to that in the show notes because that explains it in detail. And
I would say the important part is to really understand what keeps something from being collected. So the GC root, meaning that, it's the top of this thing that it traverses. It starts at one object, it looks at the references and so on and so on. And when you're troubleshooting memory problems, you need to be able to figure out, why is this thing not eligible for collection if you're getting it out of memory, and then trace it back to a GC root and be like, and figure out where along the chain is something keeping a reference to something else that it shouldn't be. And they recently introduced in Android Studio 1.3 a much better UI in Android Studio itself for tracing back these references to the GC roots. And I think you guys also mentioned on a previous podcast the LeakCanary tool from Square that will also help point you to these problems. So it's getting a lot easier to troubleshoot these things than it used to be. It used to be you had to take a heap dump, and then you had to run heap dump convert to make it a Java heap dump, and then you had to load up Eclipse memory analyzer tool and look at it that way. So it's multiple steps to figure it out. So it's definitely getting a lot easier, and hopefully will continue to.
And just to be clear, with Art, the new compiler, the garbage collection is way better. That doesn't necessarily mean that you're free to just start allocating more objects. These are unfortunately constraints that you always have to sort of keep an eye on. And while the garbage collection is improved, it hasn't sort of like eliminated this process altogether. So you still have to be a little conscious. And that's why we're going to go into some of these good Java recommendations, and a common pattern that you'll sort of find throughout is that, oh, well, this is a good Java pattern to follow. But on Android, you don't necessarily have to do it this way, or you shouldn't be doing it this way. And the reason we brought up the topic of garbage collection is it boils down to that allocation procedure. Because you have such a constrained environment, you basically can't go whole hog and keep allocating objects, even though it would make it clear, it would make the code clearer and sort of more readable. One topic is mutable objects and immutable objects, right? And again, this boils down to this concept of like creating objects, creating more objects versus not having to create more objects. Now, as I understand, in general programming, they say mutable objects are a good thing, right? It's always good to have immutable objects. To be clear, mutable objects are objects that are mutable, which basically means they can change. Immutable objects are objects that can't change. So in Java, string, for example, is an immutable object. So once you create a string, you can't modify the string. The only way you can do that is by concatenating it and creating a new object for the new value.
Can you explain that a little bit? Because I think most introduction developers don't understand that. I mean, because if I create a string and it says string first name equals Don, and then I say first name, or just say name, string name equals Don, and then a couple lines later I say name equals name plus Felker, To me, I look like I'm just changing the name variable. So what are you saying is happening?
So essentially what happens is when you say string is equal to Don, like when you create your first string saying string is equal to Don, then that's it. Like, if you have DONN, that's only the allowed number of characters that you can have on the first string object. Now, if you do but it doesn't seem like that because you can always just do like, Don plus and then a Felker, right? What actually happens in the background is like you have Don one string, you have Felker the second string. It actually recreates a new string of the size. It computes the size of both Don and Felker and creates a new object, assigns both of those values to that object, and then sort of like appears like it's just one object. So really you're creating a whole new object. You're not modifying the existing string. You're not modifying the existing Don string.
Okay.
So it creates this new object. And because it creates a new object altogether, that's, again, like sort of not looked at as a good thing in Android. Now, there are a bunch of qualifiers to this. So the way you avoid this is basically using a string buffer. So if you use a string buffer, which is another sort of data construct, it allows you to sort of like, it's a mutable form of string. Now, I know, again, so the problem is, I think JVMs have gotten super smart at this point. So it was like a sort of recommended practice to not do string concatenation, like with the plus sort of characters. But I think after JDK5 or something, this is actually inherently done. Like, so what the compiler does is it sees a string concatenation and it's like, oh, I know this is a string concatenation, and it swaps it out in the background with a string buffer. Is that right, Michael?
Yeah, so, I mean, the compile, and again, it can depend on the compiler and the possibly even the runtime, I suppose. But you can, if you're doing just like one time, not in a for loop, then I think, plus is probably fine for most situations. Where still, even in the most recent versions of Java, I think you still have to be really careful is when you're doing a plus equals of a string. If you have a string and you plus equals in a for loop or in some sort of loop, then that loop becomes n squared in terms of the final string, that you're in, and it has constantly recreating strings, copying strings, and recreating strings because you're adding on every time through the loop to a larger and larger string, and the string's getting larger every time through the loop. So every time it's a larger copy and a larger copy. So, and I think this is one of the things that they touch on in effective Java is that specifically plus equals of a string in a loop is, I think, going to be quadratic in terms of the amount of memory it takes up.
Yep, makes sense.
Now, kind of moving on from that topic in general, I think one of the big things in Android is just understanding basic data structures. And the one question I have for you, Michael, you've been doing this for a long time in Java. How important is it for developers to understand just the common data structures? And what would you say maybe even the top 3 data structures that you see used in Android development are right now?
Yeah, I think, using the right data structure for the problem you're trying to solve obviously can make a huge difference. You want to make sure that it's something that's not using more memory than it needs to. It's not doing too much allocation. But another really important thing too is if you're sharing data across threads, getting concurrency right is very hard. And a lot of the default ones, you have to do your own synchronization around them. So those are kind of the things you need to think about when choosing a specific data structure. Android does have some data structures that are specifically made for Android to be more efficient. So array map and I think a simple array map are data structures where normally you can use a hash map, but for most cases, if you're only putting if the most things you ever put into a data structure is 5 or 10 things, then a hash map is probably overkill, right? And an array map can be much more efficient.
So why is that internally? Yeah. Like why exactly does that happen?
So in an array map, you can, if you know it's a small number of things, then you can just keep things in a simple linear data structure, and you don't have to worry about kind of the big O of it because your in is small. You're only going to have 10 things, 20 things. So it doesn't matter if you're on a linear type algorithm versus a constant time algorithm. Whereas hash map is very optimized because it can give you constant type O of 1 operations across large sets of data, but that comes as a constant overhead. So for very small data sets, you're still paying that constant overhead when you're never going to put thousands of things in the map anyway. So using something that can just allocate a fixed amount of memory or fixed array and put things in those buckets and not have to do hashing and things like that can be much more efficient if you know ahead of time that the data that's ever going to be in that data structure is going to be relatively small.
Exactly, and I think that's like the key point there. Like the hashing algorithm that's used, you don't necessarily have to go whole hog with it. And I think the folks at Android came up with array map so that it's sort of a very lightweight implementation of hash map. It must be said though, like Michael pointed out, if you have like a whole bunch of, if you have an extremely large number of items, at that point you probably shouldn't be using array map. But more often than not, I don't think people are going to hit this case, at least on the client side.
And I think just a general advice is any time you're picking between data structures, you really want to measure. I mean, if it's going to matter, you want to measure before you pick something. If it's not causing you problems, then you just want to go for the most readable code, right?
Right, absolutely.
How would someone that's not familiar with measuring, how would you measure the impact on memory and so forth of a particular data structure?
So it's interesting with Android, right? Because some of these data structures are only in the Android SDK. So if you want to measure with those different ones, you're going to have to run it in some sort of Android instrumentation. I think there are tools that, and micro benchmarking is, I think, a hard thing to get right. There are some tools like Caliper, and I think a tool called Vogar that allow you to, if you have a specific algorithm or specific flow through a data structure and you're trying to, and it's impacting your performance and you want to do it, you can use those things. And I think Vogar will actually run code on an Android instance for you so that you can do micro benchmarks if you want to do it at that level. If you're at a kind of more higher level in Android, if you just want to load up your app, there's things like allocation tracker that can show you where things are being allocated. So if you think if you're allocating too frequently or if things aren't getting deallocated, that'll help you analyze that. So it really depends on what you're trying to measure, but Android provides a lot of tools, and then there's a lot of tools specific to just Java that you can do micro benchmarks. But I would say always start with the most readable code, and then if you find yourself running into problems, then measure first so that you at least know if you're making things better or worse by any changes that you make.
Golden advice there. And I guess like the important thing to also understand is like these data structures, like there's array map, there's simple array map. These are Android API specific, which means you can't use that in pure Java code. So that's one reason that I always try to use like the most generic, the most readable form, like from like the core Java APIs. And only if there comes a point where I'll have to sort of optimize, will I try to switch these data structures.
When I'm reading most code, be it I walk into a new client or open source code, I have to say the most common data structures that I see out there are going to be hash map and array list. An array list probably it hits the top of the list there in general, pun not intended. Now, do you guys have any issues with the array list? Is there anything wrong that you see with the array list? Is there anything you need to be careful about, or is it kind of just a general use list in your opinion?
I want to say, I think I heard somewhere, and I haven't actually confirmed this with the source code, but I think maybe it was array list, or maybe I'm thinking of hash map, but the Android data structures, actually, when you instantiate them, the default capacity, meaning before you even add anything, the default capacity, I think it's smaller. It may be actually 0 in some spots where you say new, I can't remember if it's array list or hash map, where you say new array list, and by default it gives you 0 room in there, so it doesn't allocate any memory, which is good if you're not going to need it. But if you know, like, I'm always going to have at least 5 things in there, you can in the constructor to array list, you can pass a 5. So it knows like, okay, I'm going to start with 5 because I know you're going to at least have 5. So there's no use in starting with 0 and having to reallocate later to give you 5. So I would say that, yes, array list can be great for, depending on how your usage pattern, it's great for random access. If you need to access the nth thing, you can just in a constant time operation, you can look up and set the nth thing in the array. So it really depends on matching with your access, your read and write patterns on the list, and which one's going to be most efficient.
Quick follow-up to that question, Michael. So the initial size that you provide, so an array list is basically an expandable list, right? So you can keep it will automatically resize itself to accommodate the number of objects that you provide. The initial size that you provide, is that also, so in the background when it expands, does it also use the same initial size that you provide to expand? So if I say 10, does that mean it'll add 10 more elements as you get close to the full the size of the array list?
I don't know it's definitely an implementation detail, and in Android might do it different than desktop Java, but generally people, probably start out at doing some sort of like, doubling it every time you need to expand. But because it's on top of arrays, which are fixed size in Java, it has to allocate and copy everything every time it needs to expand.
Right.
So even if you can avoid 1 or 2 expansions of the array, it might be optimizing in a place that you don't need to optimize anyway. So again, measure first, but it can be something to look at.
Homework for our listeners.
All right.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. So another general sort of recommendation is there are these cool data structures and objects, but really, if you can get away with using primitives, if your requirement is sort of fulfilled by just using primitives, and by primitives we mean like int, long, boolean, short. If you can get away with using these without the object forms, then absolutely always use that, right? And the reason we actually say that you should try to avoid objects is because, again, this goes into sort of like core Java and like the amount of memories that's allocated to each of these sort of constructs, right? So for boolean, it's basically 1 byte. A character, char, char, or short, it occupies 2 bytes. Now this is good trivia. I always like popping this question. So short, there's something very interesting about short that most of us Android developers should know. So a short is essentially 2 bytes, right? So that's 16-bit. So 1 byte is basically 8-bit. And so if you have 16-bit, the maximum number that can actually be stored in a short is basically 65,536. Does that look familiar to you guys?
It seems like maybe that's the limit on the number of methods you can have in a single DEX file.
Yeah.
And that's actually the reason you hit that limit. So people don't generally understand why. I mean, like, that seems like such a bizarrely weird number to choose in terms of like a maximum method number count. And the truth is, it isn't like a random thing. It's a very specific sort of number.
Yeah, and I think specifically in the DEX file format, when you have a DEX bytecode, it says, invoke this method, and then there's a table of methods at the top that lists all the methods that can call in that DEX file, and each method has an ID, and the field that holds the ID is 16-bit. So when you're saying call this method in a Dalvik bytecode, you're saying call the method with ID 1234, and literally in the table at the top of the DEX file, you can't list more than 65,000 methods because there's only 16 bits there to give it method IDs.
Right. It's kind of funny, right? I mean, the reason like such a big constraint is sort of like put on us developers is because like the data structure chosen there was a short. It's kind of, it makes me chuckle sometimes.
The first time I saw it, I saw the number 65,000, and I remember back to the college days, and I thought, I'm like, wait a second, that number looks very familiar for some reason. I go look up, the limits on the primitive types, and I'm like, oh, there it is. I'm like, okay, I see the problem.
Yeah. And the difference between char and short, at least practically, is that a char is signed, where a short is unsigned, or vice versa, actually.
Right.
So a char is unsigned, I think, and a short is signed. maybe I got that mixed up. But that's the main thing. So the values you can actually
store
in a char and a short are slightly different because one can have negative numbers and the other can't.
Yes.
So you don't have it memorized, Michael. You didn't make the interview. Sorry. You get the position. Just kidding.
Yeah, I mean, it's short is because everything I think except char is signed. I think char is the only unsigned thing. Yeah.
Right. So, I mean, like along the same lines, int and float basically is 4 bytes, long and double is 8 bytes. And here's the interesting thing. Anytime you use an object, so it doesn't matter what object it is, any object that you use in Java, there's a certain amount that's allocated towards just housekeeping. Because if it's an object, then you have to construct the object and like you should actually know how to sort of like organize this object. And so 8 bytes is just simply allocated to the object, like without any sort of like, so even if it's a Boolean object, so there's the Boolean primitive and there's the Boolean object. The Boolean object in itself, just for housekeeping, it has 8 bytes. And then because it contains a Boolean primitive inside the object, it has an additional 1 byte. And you may think, okay, cool, so that's 9 bytes, right? No, it's actually not 9 bytes because this thing is, again, byte rounded, and this is done because I don't know, Michael, you can maybe like correct me, but my understanding is that like it just makes it easier to sort of like read from the memory if you have like a sort of rounded, like a byte rounded sort of accessing each of these from the memory is easier when you have it byte rounded, right? So instead of 9 bytes, it's actually 16 bytes.
I mean, and it's about at the limit of some of my knowledge, but I think it might have to do with how the processor does, byte alignment has to do with how efficiently a processor can access things in memory. So if it's byte aligned, then the memory reads are more efficient. But I think how much it takes up is somewhat dependent on the JVM implementation or the Dalvik or ART. But yeah, it can definitely be more than you would think.
So the next topic is basically on loops, iterators, and all that jazz. So actually, on a very recent episode of ADB, Chet Haas, the troublemaker, the constant troublemaker. So he basically talked about this in detail, and he noticed this weirdness in the way the for each, the enhanced for loop, as it's called, is used. So we'll actually add a link to that. But basically, the TLDR of that whole sort of conversation is that you generally want to use the old-fashioned for loops where you specify the size and not the for each syntax unless it's for an array. So there are mild quirks to this. So we just want to point listeners to this. In Android, they always say it's better. And the reason is because the for each loop, in addition, it always uses an iterator object. So even if you have an empty sort of array list and you run a for each on, you run the enhanced for loop on this array list, even if it's empty, it is going to have a single allocation for the iterator. And then it'll look at the iterator and say, oh, I don't have any elements. So you're sort of wasting a whole allocation there. So we'll add a link to that episode, and it's kind of interesting because he talks about how when you actually have when he was checking the allocation tracker for animations, he noticed using the for each syntax took a mild hit. So what else is interesting in the land of Android and quirks with Java?
I think the one thing that you bring up, Chet, in the recent Android Developers Backstage episode, and he talks about avoiding enums. Mm-hmm. I know for myself, and I think Kaushik, you're the same way, is that you never really like this rule.
Yeah.
I mean, you can get around this with, now using the int def annotation. Mm-hmm. And it's, in my opinion, it's all right. It's an okay work around it. I think it's a throwback from me from coming from a different language where we use enums heavily to help specify different types and so forth. And most companies I consult with still use enums quite heavily. But now it's kind of being advised to not use them. What are your thoughts on this, Michael? Do you agree, disagree, or how do you feel about it?
Yeah, I think that they've had various performance documents over the years on the Android development side, and I think this one has been there on some performance document out there for quite some time about not using enums. I've always ignored this rule, mainly because I think enums can avoid a lot of programming mistakes, and they have some really good properties. If you read the first edition of Effective Java, they had a chapter on Typesafe Enums, which is essentially the pattern that got baked into Java in 1.5. And it's just, it can avoid a whole class of potential bugs in your code. So to me, if we have an app that performs well enough and it does what the user needs to do and adds value to the user, whether or not I use enums at the end of the day is not my is not my biggest concern. Making sure that I don't have random fragment lifecycle crashes and things that impact the user more is where I spend more of my time. If I get into some drawing code and I'm trying to draw a special widget and I notice that it's janky and it looks like the enums are causing the problem, then yeah, I'll rip them out and try to see what I can do to make it more efficient. But I try to, we're always trying to figure out ways to deliver more value to our customers faster, right? So if I can write simpler code that, when I come back and read it in 3 months, that I can understand it better, I'll always go for that first and then, measure and optimize if I run into a problem. And I think Chet mentioned in that podcast that, the framework team has different concerns because their code runs on every device inside of every app. So a little performance improvement that they can make has a huge impact across the entire Android ecosystem. So I think it's a bit of a different problem.
Yep.
But it's definitely, all of these things are good to know about when you are having jank in your application and you need to go figure it out. And it's in a critical part of your application that's gonna really bug the user. Then that's when I think the time is to go and apply all these knowledge. But if you don't have all these knowledge, you're just going to be looking at your code and being like, I don't know how to make this faster. So it's good to know all these things.
I agree. It's developer productivity and maintainability of code in a code base for a team is huge. If for some reason the productivity is taking a hit because we're using integers and it's slowing the release cycle for some weird reason, then we need to evaluate our development practices because we're probably not experiencing that many problems. I'm in the same boat as you. I was just recently developing a custom view and had some jank and moved a few things around. So good points on that.
The golden rule is always code for clarity, always to begin with, and then start optimizing later.
Now, speaking of that, optimize later and code for clarity, one of those big things is I see sometimes is to avoid, I see people saying avoid nulls inside of your code. You'll see this all over the place, even in the framework. It says, hey, pass in null and you'll get the default default setting, or sometimes you'll get a null back from a cursor or something like that. And so what I've learned to do in Android in almost all my development, any language now, is I just assume everything I get is going to be null. And just figure out a way to handle that inside the code, perhaps an error message, perhaps a dialogue, a retry, something of that nature. And that has reduced the crashes that I've encountered significantly. Now, Michael, what's your thoughts on nulls in general? Are you someone who returns null if certain things happen, or do you use like the empty object pattern or anything of that nature? What's your thoughts on it?
I usually, when it makes sense, try to use the null object pattern where, for example, if you have returning a list from something rather than returning null when there's not anything, you return just an empty list. And you can, in that case, you can be more efficient by calling like collections.emptyList, which will return a pre-baked thing, and you don't have to allocate a new list necessarily. I always prefer to keep nulls out of my code.
What's the advantage of doing that? I think
for me, it's just easier to understand the code rather than have to look through all these null checks everywhere. And in Java, I don't think you can get away from that entirely, but in areas you can. I think the @nullable and @non-null annotations are very valuable.
Oh, yeah.
So you can say, like, this thing might be null, and then you know if you need to check for it or not. And things like Findbugs and other static analysis tools can say, like, hey, you called a method on this object, and we know it might be null, so you need to check for null first. Or you can say non-null, and then when the method returns something, it can say, hey, you said this method was non-null, but you're now returning something that might be null, so you might be crashing people who are calling your method. So giving those hints of null and non-null can help the static analysis tools tell you where you need to check for null and not. But that being said, when it makes sense, I definitely prefer the null object pattern. If I can have an object, even just a dummy implementation of an object, if it makes sense, where the implementation does nothing, and I can just call through the methods, and it will do nothing. Now you have to be careful about that, because then sometimes you think you're doing something and you're calling a null implementation, and it's not doing anything. But I generally tend to prefer that over having null checks everywhere. And I think that's, I'm not super familiar with Kotlin, but I think that's one of the promising things to me in Kotlin is it has optional nulls as part of the type system. In the type system, you can say this thing is an optional, and then if it's an optional with a question mark after it, then you know whether or not it could be null, and otherwise the types can never be null and things like that. So I think that the concept of null built into the type system with optionals is a very powerful concept.
Right. And the other huge advantage is that basically it's not an additional case you have to account for, right? If you return an empty object, then you can just consider it as like a normal case.
There's another topic that's out there that's kind of heavily talked about is anonymous inner classes. Some people use them all the time. Some people say that they're bad. And you'll notice even in the example code, a lot of times you'll see listeners that are inlined as anonymous inner classes. And we don't have the luxury of Lambda expressions just yet. And so if you are using things like RxJava, you have to use either just the traditional JDK6 stuff, which you do anonymous inner classes, or you can create an instance as a field somewhere, or you can use retro Lambda. What are your thoughts, Michael, on anonymous inner classes? Do you use them? Are they bad? What's your thoughts in general?
Yeah, I mean, they definitely have their place, but they're definitely a source of memory leaks, I think, because you do have the concept of the enclosing instance. So if you have a inner class, and it's kind of the difference between an inner class versus a nested class. So nested class doesn't have a reference, and that's when you put the static keyword in front. And an inner class has that reference to an enclosing class. So if that enclosing class is an activity or something that references an activity, you potentially now and then you pass that anonymous instance to something that's long-lived, like it's an observable in RxJava that never gets unsubscribed, or you pass it to some other part of the Android system that's going to hold on to that listener or that inner class. Now that inner class has a reference to your activity, and your activity can't be freed, so then you have a potential memory leak. So you have to use them very much with care. I find most of the time you can pass in, sometimes you need access to certain things inside of your this callback that you're passing to RxJava or other things. But if you explicitly add it to the constructor of that callback, then at least you know where you're having references to, and you don't have this sort of invisible reference to the enclosing class. So if you're like, well, I need a reference to this thing and that thing, sometimes you need an anonymous inner class or not an anonymous inner class. Sometimes you need a class that has a reference to an activity. But if you pass that activity in as an explicit parameter, at least it makes it very clear to everybody that I am holding on to a reference to this activity, and I meant to, and I'm really hoping that I get unsubscribed, or I'm doing something to make sure that this thing doesn't live around forever with a reference to the activity. So making it more explicit by having static nested classes and passing in the state that you need into the constructor of that static nested class can make the code a lot easier to reason about and a lot less likely to have hidden mysterious references that cause memory leaks.
One trick that I use with Intellij in my color formatting, you can specify for anonymous inner classes like it to be styled a little differently. So I basically style it with like a red font color and italics. So anytime if I'm like browsing through code or looking through someone else's code, and then that just like pops out, and like especially on Android, like if I see that, then I know like, okay, this is something that I have to be a little more cautious about. So that I think was super useful. I learned and picked a bunch of things from Michael. Thank you, Michael.
Yeah, I learned a ton as well. It's been great having you on the show. We really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me. It's been a lot of fun. I've been a listener since the beginning, and it's a great podcast.
You're a good man, Michael.
It's time for the awesome picks of the week. So I think there's quite a few here. Let's change it up a little bit this time. Michael, why don't you go ahead and go first and let us know what some of the awesome picks of the week that you have to share with the listeners are.
Yep. So one of the things that I try to do is, even though it breaks up my development time and it's slightly a detour, is when I find bugs in the tools, or even things that I wish it had done this, I file a feature request or a bugs on the Android tools tracker. And a number of things have gotten fixed. Features have gotten implemented over time. They have a lot on their plate. But I would highly recommend people, if you think that they go onto the bug tracker and file things, because if you noticed it, chances are that if you file it and it gets fixed, you're helping lots and lots of Android developers.
Yeah.
The one thing I will note, and there's the link that I have, is that they put up some advice on filing bugs. So when you file a bug, there are specific logs and specific things you can attach to the bug report and information that will make sure that they pay attention to that bug report. So a good quality bug report, in my experience, the tools team will pay attention to it, and they will try to fix your issue. They have limited resource, so it does take some time occasionally, but they're very good about getting to your issues if you file a proper bug report. So take a look at their guidelines for how to file a bug, and if you think of something, don't just let it slip by. File it, provide the information they need, and you'll help all of us Android developers out.
Fantastic.
Another link I have is a list that went up. I think Jake Wharton created it, or at least he linked to it, about a list of Android conferences. So there's a lot of them out there. Various ones are in various stages of call for papers, and it's a great list to know what ones are coming up and which ones are asking for speakers. So if you're interested in trying to do an Android talk, you can apply to the various ones, and maybe your talk will get accepted to one or more of the conferences. So that's a great list there. And going along with the conferences, there's another conference that doesn't seem to be quite as well publicized, but they just announced this year's version of it, and it's the Google Test Automation Conference. I went for the first time in 2014. If you're interested in testing, it's a great conference. Even if you don't go in person, they live stream it, and they post a lot of the talks afterwards. So it's not Android specific. They do a lot of automated testing across a lot of technologies. Sometimes there is some Android talks there, but it's just general good advice about how to automate your testing. So take a look at the Google Test Automation Conference. And my last link is something I think we touched upon before, and Chet Haas talked about it on the recent Android Developers Backstage podcast, and they announced it at I/O as well, is the whole set of Medium blog posts about developing for Android. So what they did is they went and talked to the framework team. They kind of consolidated all this advice about things you need to think about or should be aware of, like don't use enums and memory and network and things like that. It's good to be aware of them, even if you're not going to apply all of them to your code. It's just a good collection of advice, especially if you're new to Android, to just go read through that stuff, and it'll catch you up on a couple of years worth of Android advice that has come out in bits and pieces. It's all collected in one nice spot. So definitely check that out.
Yeah, they are, I guess, at this point on like the 9th sub post, like the 9th post or the 9th article, or I guess if memory serves me right. Amazing. That's just like an amazing introduction. Chet Haas, always a troublemaker, but the good kind. All right, so going for my picks. It is my nefarious plan to always somehow mention RxJava in each of these episodes. We managed to do that even without my awesome pick, but I thought I'll just put this in again. There's this library that's surprisingly not as well known as some of the other Rx libraries, and it's called Android Reactive Location. This surfaced up, I guess, on Reddit at some point, and I thought it was like really cool because people know that dealing with the location APIs on Android is kind of a little messy because it's hard. Like you have to like listen for location updates. You should have like a location listener, and then you have to unsubscribe. But someone went through the trouble of sort of morphing the whole thing into an Rx-like pattern. So you can basically use the same location APIs from Google, but in an RxC fashion. So I thought that was super cool. So I'll point everyone to that in the show notes. The next recommendation that I have is actually an app, and the app is called One Today, and it's over from the folks at Google. And what it basically does is it allows you to give donations to various charitable organizations. And I think it's in the days of Holo, it was like a very well done application and the concept is very nice. So every day it'll pop up a push notification saying, hey, these are some of the causes that you said you were interested in. Would you like to donate $1 or maybe donate $5, and we'll try to match your donation with other people. So I think if you're not someone like Bill Gates and you don't have the flow to sort of like give that much money, it's just a very nice application. And because it's from Google, there's some trust that they would have vet some of these organizations. So I thought that was a very nice app. And in case people haven't heard of it, should definitely download and look it up. And my last is basically an article. I know many a time when you talk to Android developers and it comes up in conversation, the whole legal battle between Oracle and Google and what's happening with Java. One of my colleagues, Dan Perez, recommended this to me and I thought it was really good. It's a sort of nice take towards this whole controversy that's going on between Oracle and Google. So it's an interesting read, and especially if you're talking to other developers who are sort of interested in this topic, it's always nice to have some information on the subject. So those are my 3 awesome picks.
All right, for me, I have 3 picks as well. First one is actually, I'm asking you all to please vote for my talks at DroidCon NYC. So a little shameless self-promotion here. I actually have 3 that are kind of various different talks. One is have a talk out for lean development tactics for Android. The other name for it could possibly be staying sane and productive in a startup environment while you're building Android apps. How to stay sane, and that's a lot of tips from technical to mental to sleep and health and so forth, and how I've been able to thrive and survive in a startup environment. The other talk is driving user engagement 101, or basically creating sticky type of users, how to get your users to coming back inside your apps, app re-engagement practices, and so forth. A lot of the things that I help various different companies implement. And the last one is a talk I've given a few times, which is Android build variants. So if you're going to go to DroidCon NYC, please go to droidcon.nyc and vote for my talks. Next one is, next 2 are not really Android-based, but they're something that I use every single day and I feel I should bring up. One is the Anker, and I could be pronouncing this totally wrong, Anker charging station. And it's a 5-port USB charging station that I bought off of Amazon, and it's probably the most heavily used thing in my house, to the point where I'm going to be buying another one soon. It will charge your devices, iPads, other tablets, Android phones, etc. Very quickly, and it's 5 ports, so you don't have to have wires all over your entire house in various different locations. So it's very useful for keeping your devices charged, the ones that you use on a day-to-day basis. And the last thing is a standing desk, and that's the $22 IKEA standing desk. A lot of people have probably heard about this, but I have one at my co-working space that I've set up, and every time someone sees it, they ask how I knew how to build it. So it's not as widely known as I thought. And this link shows you how you can, with just $22, go to IKEA, pick up 3 different things, grab a couple screws that maybe you're laying around in your empty toolbox, and put together a standing desk. I've been using this $22 standing desk for close to 3.5 years at this point, and I stand about 70% of the time every day. It's totally worth it. So if you're afraid of dropping $500 to $1,000+ on a standing desk, check out this $22 standing desk option. I originally got the inclination to start it because I wanted to check out a standing desk and didn't want to spend $1,000, and decided that if I liked it, I would buy one. And now 3.5 years later, I'm still using it and still haven't bought a $1,000 desk. So it's a cheap alternative.
Was it very difficult adjusting it for your height, Don?
It actually is, and I actually have the desks that I have are IKEA desks, the regular desk ones, and I can adjust the height of the legs. And so I bump up my desk probably about 4 inches higher than most people. And then I put the standing stuff on top of that. So it's actually perfect height for me. But if I had a regular size desk and I built the $22 standing desk, it would be probably about 4 inches too low.
It would be a sitting desk then.
At our Palo Alto office, they have those nice electric ones that are going up and down, with the buttons. I haven't been able to convert myself to a standing desk, so I just have to go in, and whatever desk I use, I just have to lower it to sitting. So.
I am not standing today.
Yeah.
I'm sitting
I'm
down.
not standing, but at least they're electronic, and I can lower it to sitting.
That's funny.
All right. So you can find the show notes for this episode at fragmentedpodcast.com/episodes/10. If you have feedback or suggestions for us, as always, please feel free to add your comments at the show notes. Alternatively, the best way is to just send a tweet to either Don or me on Twitter. And we also have Fragmented Cast as the Twitter handle for our podcast. So feel free to send in suggestions, feedback on that Twitter feed. Thank you again, Michael, so much for joining us today. It means a lot to both Don and I. We both are big fans of your talks and the stuff that you put out. If people want to reach out to you, though, what's the best way they can do that?
You can find me on Twitter. My Twitter handle is YogurtEarl on Twitter. Feel free to reach out for anything Android related, or even if you want to learn more about how we do Android-y things at Amex.
Nice. I need to ask, what's the story behind YogurtEarl?
Yes, I get that question a lot. So there's a thing called a mondegreen, and you can look it up on Wikipedia. Maybe we'll put a show note in for it. But essentially it was a poem, and at the end of the poem, they said, laid them on the green, and somebody thought it said, Lady Mondegreen. So it was basically a mishearing of a normal sentence to sound like something else. There's a game based on that called Mad Gab. So there's a game called Mad Gab where it's essentially a bunch of mondegreens, and there's a game based around that. So I had a friend about 2004 who was trying to come up with his own. He's like, I could come up with one of these things that's in the game. And so his was, and his name was Alan, his was You Go Girl, and somehow You Go Girl sounded like Yogurt Earl.
Okay.
So Yogurt Earl was what it sounded like, and somehow he started calling me Yogurt Earl. I'm not sure how he made that transition.
Wow.
And then it was about the time that Gmail was coming out, and so I needed a unique handle on the internet that wasn't used everywhere, and I could sign up with the same user ID everywhere. So I'm like, well, I'll try Yogurt Earl. And so about 10 years ago, that stuck, and so it started with Gmail and Twitter and so on.
So funny. You are doomed now every time I see you.
Okay, so if you want to get in touch with Don, how do we do that, Don?
You can get in touch with me on Twitter at Don Felker. That's DONNFELKER. That's with 2 N's. Or you can reach me at my website at donfelker.com.
Excellent. And if people want to reach me, I'm Kaushik Gopal, KAUSHIKGOPAL on Twitter. And my website is a little smaller. It's kaush.co. That's KAUSH.co. Thank you all for listening, and hope to see you next week.